Despite having been originally intended for the use of scuba divers, the dive watch as a category has grown to dominate the watch market while also laying claim to what is perhaps the most iconic design of all time in the Rolex Submariner. But looking beyond the most popular dive watches on the market, there are a number of hidden gems that I think deserve more attention. And in this video, I'm gonna shine some light on some underrated dive watches that you should know. We're gonna start from more affordable end and then move our way up to the luxury side of things. Now, generally, I'm going to go in ascending order of price. Also, some other considerations are going to be major brands only, so no micro brands, because that'll open it up to a whole nother just type of video. They must have dive watch characteristics, so we're looking at water resistance, rotating bezel, screw down crown, things of that sort also need to be here to qualify. The watches don't have to necessarily be ISO rated, but those are just some characteristics that I would look for. And then finally, what classifies as underrated, I think will ultimately come down to the individual. As somebody that deals with watches all day, you might, of course, be familiar with a lot of these, but really the hope of this video is to just shine the light on some of these watches that maybe don't get as much attention as other watches on the market, or there's another more popular model from the brand that typically gets more of the shine. But before we jump into the first watch, I do want to recommend, if you want more things, all dive watches, not just underrated ones, but just all dive watches, we have a list of over 50 of the top dive watches on the market currently in 2022, some of our picks on our staff and our team. So if you want that, link will be in the description down below. Good jumping off point for your research. But as I was mentioning about maybe falling victim to the success of another model within the collection, here we have the Orient Canoe. I would say the Orient Canoe is probably maybe 3 or 4 on the list of Orient dive watches that get the most attention, but it, from a design standpoint, might be my favorite. It is going to be larger, 44 millimeters for the case size, thickness of 12.9 millimeters, and a lug to lug of 50.5 millimeters. If you put on a rubber strap, I would say it wears slightly more compact than that. On the wrist, I'd say generally a 42 millimeter watch, all things considered. 200 meters of water resistance, not getting ISO compliance, but really will have you covered in pretty much every scenario. Automatic Orient F6922 on the inside, mineral crystal. Probably not as popular as the Kamasu or the Makos or even the Rays out there, but I think the Canoe is certainly a good all-arounder that, just from a design perspective, probably one of the more visually appealing, in my opinion, from Orient. Next, we have the Bulova Devil Diver. This is one of my personal favorites. Not a watch that I would conventionally go for, but I just like the looks of this one. There's nothing else truly like it from a contemporary perspective. This is so 1970s in terms of its approach, with the handsets, the inner dial track, with the raised markers that just almost look like small little water droplets. They're very interesting, and this dial is just not like anything else you're going to find. You have this Cyclops at the date for 3 o'clock. There is a larger case variant, but there's also a smaller case variant at 41 millimeters with that orange option that kind of reminds me of a Doxa Sub and what it's going for. A broader case in terms of those lugs and architecture, but lug to lug, very compact, going to wear like a true 40 on the wrist. Sapphire crystal, 200 meters of water resistance. Probably the number one downside of this watch is going to be the Mido caliber on the inside. Not that it's a bad or unreliable movement, but just that you're seeing an 8 series caliber in a watch that's coming in a price range around $600-700. For our next watch, we have the Seiko SPB 177, aka the Seiko Sumo. Now, I was struggling to even consider putting a Seiko watch on this list because so many of their watches are cult classics. The Sumo certainly has its following, but comparing it to something like the Samurai, the Turtle, even something like the Tuna, I don't think it gets as much love in comparison. The name is going to be a nice characteristic of how this one wears, 45 millimeters on the case size, but still pretty broad lug to lug. This one does wear more compact, but not to the same degree a Turtle will. 12.9 millimeters in thickness, 200 meters of water resistance, 6R35 movement on the inside, so that 70-hour power reserve, sapphire crystal on top, ISO rated, and this one specifically comes with these cool waffle dial variants that I think is just adds some more visual interest than normal. So I am jumping around with price a little bit more, but still keeping things under $2,000 and under $1,000 for some of these next few. Next, we have the Marathon Gsar, the government search and rescue. One of my personal favorite watches from a tool watch category for the price segment. Marathon was making watches for the Allied Forces starting back around 1941 and have really just continued this reputation ever since. They're also one of the few brands that utilizes tritium gas tubes on their watches. And then the dial that has become the kind of synonymous with this Gsar collection has this deep-seated nature. That's done for 2 reasons. One, for just the overall looks, but the other reason is you need the ability to pass over the raised markers of those tritium gas tubes on the inside. Tritium is going to be a constant illuminating material, so it's not going to need to be charged. It does have a shelf life though of typically around 15 to 25 years, give or take. It's more of an approximate estimation depending on the watch. Marathon watches have a pretty wide spectrum in terms of their pricing, but generally once you start getting over $1,000, that's when you can get access to the Gsar. There's also the medium search and rescue watches as well if you want something a little bit smaller. 39 millimeters on the case diameter, but the bezel diameter brings it out to 41, but it wears like a true 40 on the wrist. They're shifting over to Sellita calibers, but Sellita, absolutely fine reputation. Love Sellita movements inside of all the watches that I own with them. Sapphire crystal, but this watch is pretty much unlike anything else. If you see this watch, you're like, okay, that thing looks pretty rugged, and it is. So Hamilton, despite their great reputation when it comes to field watches, when it comes to dive watches, they're not as well known for that. They have their frogmen, but the watch that I always liked that had that diver-esque aesthetic was the Hamilton Khaki Navy Scuba. The problem with the Navy Scuba was it really wasn't built like a diver. It did have an elapsed time bezel, but it didn't have the greatest lume. It didn't have kind of the up spec and performance that you would expect from a water resistance department. 100 meters is nothing to sneeze at, but I think it did have some desires out there to have something a bit more. And they recently have updated and upgraded the Hamilton Khaki Navy Scuba, now going to be more of a pro type of option for those out there. Not going to necessarily be on the same plane as a Seiko or something of that sort, but still very well done and certainly a step forward. It is going to come with a 43 millimeter case, lug to lug of 52 millimeters, but the upgrade here, 300 meters of water resistance. Lume is also going to get a bump as well. These are just more professional. These essentially are getting the Seastar 2000 treatment that we saw a year ago with those new Tissot's. So really a cool move by Hamilton. I just personally like the looks of these a lot more than the Frogmen, and I think for the mass market perspective, the same probably will be said. Now when it comes to brands with dive watch pedigree, few can outshine Doxa. But there is a watch within Doxa's catalog that doesn't get as much attention, at least from enthusiasts, I would say, or at least people that are really in love with the brand, and that is the Doxa Sub 200. The Doxa Sub 200 is that entry door to the world of Doxa. Many people are going to look at the Sub 300, the 300T. Those are the classic Jacques Cousteau style watches that people absolutely love. But if you're somebody that just wants to test the waters with the Doxa family of watches, maybe doesn't want to take the full leap, you can go for the Doxa Sub 200. Right south of $1,000, $950 on the rubber strap, $990 on the beads of rice bracelet. Both are pretty solid. 42 millimeter case with a 46 millimeter lug to lug. These wear like a 40 and a half millimeter case when strapped onto the wrist. Thickness of 13.7 millimeters. So not the thinnest watches in the world, but still pretty well done. 200 meters of water resistance at a caliber on the inside. One thing I will say about these watches that is disappointing is going to be the lume. The lume absolutely sucks. There's no way of going around it, and that is kind of disheartening when you're talking about Doxa and their just reputation when it comes to dive watches. But still, if you're getting that pop of color and you like these designs, I really do think these are charming. I think they're some of the cooler dive watches around $1,000 and one to certainly take a look at. And I would say underrated compared to some of the other Doxa watches out there. Now, next up, we have a watch that I've owned in the past. I think all in all, the case is phenomenal, and there's also some cool history with this brand, and that's Squall. The Squall 1521. This brand specifically, I know there's people like TGV that mention this brand all the time, so some people have mixed feelings about the brand in general. It's become very much like a YouTube watch, I would say, but if you look beyond that reputation and just look at the watch for what it is, it's very well done, and it also has history to go along with that. Not a big fan of the homage watches that the brand makes. I think they just make too many weird, just out there type of things. But if you look at the core of that 1521 case, I think it's just one of the better positioned dive watches, south of $1,000 in that kind of $800 to $1,000 range. I know that's a small segment of under $1,000, but it does fit perfectly within that realm. Good water resistance, solid lume, some different dial options to choose from. The case, again, though, is the star of the show. Not a big fan of the Squall brand on the side of the case. Blancpain does this, and now mentioning Blancpain too, the connection here is Squall was actually making cases for Blancpain back in the middle 20th century, also doing some work for Doxa. So the dive watch pedigree is there, reputation is there, but if you're gonna go for Squall, I would go for the 1521. That is the one with that classic case, classic wearing dimensions, and just a dive watch that just screams of that mid 20th century look and feel. Next, we have the Certina DS Super PH500M. So these watches are ones that are so hard for myself to get a hand on because Certina has no distribution in the United States for the most part. Like you just can't really get these watches as much from like different retailers out there. But when I've handled these, I was just very impressed. I would say Certina, Mido, I would see them as like sister brands. Like from a fit and finish standpoint, both are phenomenal. And Certina with these and their history of dive watches, very well done. You're looking at a 43 millimeter case. Thickness is going to be a little bit more extended out at 14.95, but it is gonna wear slightly more compact on that lug to lug angle. So not so over the top here. And then 500 meters of water resistance. But these are some of the best dive watches around that $1,000 price range. Again, sister brand to Mido in a lot of ways in terms of their positioning within the Swatch group, but very well done. So when people think of Zodiac and the Sea Wolf, from a modern context, I think they think of the colorful arrays and more playful designs, but the ones that I think are overlooked a lot and probably are my favorite from the brand are going to be the Sea Wolf skin divers. So these are the ones that are more in alignment with that original 1953 design. And if you're not familiar, Zodiac, the Sea Wolf is one of the most storied dive watches ever created. It was released the same year, announced the same year as the Blancpain 50 Fathoms and the Rolex Submariner in 1953. At the time, it was actually priced in a similar price category to those watches, but has since, of course, shifted. The brand has, it didn't necessarily succeed as much throughout the decades to follow, but now has been rejuvenated by the Fossil Group that have acquired the brand and are now operating it. And I think these are some of my favorites. The cool thing about these watches too is you're looking at a 39 millimeter diameter, but also it wears smaller than that because the bezel, and when you actually measure that central case, it's gonna wear closer to like a 38.5. It's a very compelling size for a dive watch for those that want something that wears more compact on the wrist. It's more about the business than the other versions from Zodiac. We recently put out a video looking at the history of the Sea Wolf. I think it's one of the more underappreciated dive watches, so I wanted to spotlight it a bit more. But for owners of the Sea Wolf, anybody out there that owns a Sea Wolf, I'd love to hear any experience with STP movements. There's still a lot of questions out there, I think, from owners. We've done hundreds of transactions of Zodiacs on our site and haven't had many issues, but I know some people have questions and concerns about STP movement, so any actual personal ownership stories would be helpful for those that are out there, so please leave a comment. Now, as I mentioned earlier with Certina, similar category here with Mido, I'd say classification and positioning around this south of $1,000, Mido just absolutely kills it. I think once you get one of their watches in hand, you'll probably be impressed. Some of the Ocean Stars, specifically this Ocean Star 200, might seem a little bit more generic, but if you are going for just a do-it-all first dive watch, maybe around $1,000 budget, I think Mido is certainly a brand to look at. 42.5 millimeter case. If you want something smaller, I would go for the Tribute version of the Mido Ocean Star. That's gonna have the box sapphire crystal. This has more of that flat sapphire, double AR coating, so that dial is going to pop quite a bit. 48.7 millimeters, so gonna make that watch wear closer to a 41 millimeter when on wrist. 200 meters of water resistance in this case, and a modified Etacaliber on the inside with that 80-hour power reserve to top it off. For watches that just simply check off the boxes for like the specs that we typically have as enthusiasts, Mido is so good of hitting all those different boxes. Next, we have a watch that is actually currently on my wrist. We have the Rado Captain Cook. So the Rado Captain Cook, from a dive watch around $2,000, I would say is probably one of the most underrated out there from a more well-known brand. Now, Rado in the United States, maybe not as well known as different parts of the world, specifically in the Middle East and Asia, much more popular. But this watch here, I think, is just very well done. It was originally released in 1962. They brought it back in the last several years and now have seen several iterations. They started out with a 37 millimeter variant, also having 42 millimeter options. That's the option that I'm going for. The one cool thing about the 42 millimeter options, pretty much all the watches that they make from the Captain Cook line, they do wear smaller than the case size indicates. The 42 has a 48 millimeter lug to lug, so wears closer to a 41 when on wrist. It is still large with that dial and what it's projecting out, but not overbearing even on my smaller wrist. 200 meters of water resistance, ceramic bezel on these watches as well, 80-hour power reserve, and I also just love the anchor logo at 12 o'clock that will rotate as you wear throughout the day. For those in the category of dive watch enthusiasts, you might be familiar with a brand called Aquastar. So this next one is going to be the Aquastar Deepstar chronograph. So not a brand that comes up all the time, but those that are in the weeds of dive watches, like the history of dive watches, Jacques Cousteau, you might be familiar with this brand. So this is going to be a chronograph diver. Also coming with a column wheel, unlike the cam actuated chronographs that are typically going to be in this range. This watch is inspired by the original Deepstar worn by Jacques Cousteau and his team. Comes with this bi-compact design with 30-minute chronograph register. You have a decompression calculator bezel, and then that base caliber with that 55-hour power reserve with those modifications by La Joux Perret. Hence how the column wheel is coming into play here. So now let's shift over to some luxury dive watches. And one that I certainly want to mention is the Omega Ploprof 1200 meter. So this is a watch that when you look at it for the first time, you're like, oh man, that's a face only a mother could love. But it is a watch that certainly does have its own lane and enthusiast crowd. It's almost a cult classic for Omega. It does seem like they are moving away from the Ploprof. They recently unveiled the Ultra Deep with some new variations, so it seems like they might be shifting over to that as their Ultra Deep, professionally capable dive watch that kind of fits this mold. This one is unlike pretty much anything else you're gonna wear on the wrist. 55 millimeters for the case size, thickness of 17.5 millimeters, but the lug to lug is compact, 48 millimeters. So if you've ever seen these on wrist, they do not wear like anywhere near that 55 millimeters. Of course, still being large with the overly large crown guards. So the original design was launched in 1970 as the Omega Seamaster 600 after design collaboration with commercial divers, as well as input from Jacques Cousteau's team themselves. Ploprof comes from plongeur professional, French for professional diver. The modern versions were released in the 21st century. And again, it does seem like Omega is shifting away from these watches, unfortunately. I, of course, would not be a buyer from it, but whenever a brand can show something like this and offer something like this up, I'm a fan of it, even if it's not personally for me. Next, we have the IWC Aquatimer. So the Aquatimer is another dive watch that is rather slept on and falls victim to the success of the pilot watches from IWC and even the Portuguesers and the Portofinos from IWC. This would be probably that fourth pillar. They are starting to revamp it as of late, getting some new calibers, getting an extended 5-day power reserve on these, making them much better positioned within the market. I actually should probably cover one of these in more detail. 42 millimeter case, 14.1 millimeter thickness, water resistance of 300 meters. And you get that cool bezel action with that external bezel that is mechanically connected to the internal bezel, which is pretty fun to utilize and actually see in action. Another dive watch that I think is slept on, Breitling I think is moving away from these as well, but it's probably my favorite Super Ocean out there, and that is the Super Ocean Heritage, the B20 edition. Now B20, just for some context here, so Breitling and Tudor exchanged some technologies. They gave the B01 over to Tudor, where they utilized it in the Tudor Black Bay. Then Tudor sent over the MT5612, which was in the Pelagos, and they put it inside the Super Ocean Heritage here. So you're getting a 70-hour power reserve, a COSC certified movement on the inside here, coming at a price range around $5,000. So this is kind of going head to head with some of Omega's offerings. This is not a watch that people are crazy for, but I don't think people, and I think Breitling unfortunately didn't market this watch as effectively as they probably should have. I think there was more play for this watch, and with some maybe modifications to the price, positioning, marketing, I think people could have caught on to this a bit more than what it probably originally just was resonating with different consumers out there. 42 millimeter case, 51 millimeter lug to lug, so it is broad. You do get that mesh style bracelet on this one, which I think is one of the best representations of utilizing this well on a dive watch. A lot of brands don't utilize a mesh once you start getting up higher into the price bracket. Of course, you have the No Time to Die watch from Omega, and I think that's one of the better utilizations of it, but this still is probably up there in terms of my favorite uses of a mesh bracelet on a dive watch, and from a modern perspective. It just absolutely looks the part. One of my favorite looking Breitlings, without question. Next, we have the JLC Polaris Date. The Polaris is one of those watches that, when you think of JLC, unfortunately, people just don't think of sports watches, but they do make great sports watches. And the Polaris is a collection that I think more people need to wise up with. And I think JLC also needs to consider, how can we maximize this collection more? Because what JLC shouldn't do, because there's so much fascination with looking at sports watches right now, and JLC is very much a dress watch manufacturer as well as a movement manufacturer. That's really what they're known for. But the Polaris, the Memovox, these watches are so much ingrained within their DNA as well. So if they can keep that identity while still leaning into the norms of today, I think the Polaris is that extension. It's kind of giving that olive branch out to the people that are feasting on all of these different sports watches. Polaris Date, totally underrated. 42 millimeter case, 13.9 millimeter thickness, and a lug to lug of 48.5 millimeters, 200 meters of water resistance. We recently saw the unveiling of this new green dial variant that has this cool kind of Memovox design, at least from its dial. It just kind of reminds me of those older vintage Memovox Polaris models. In-house caliber on the inside with that JLC 899AB. So this has the 4 hertz operation and a 70-hour power reserve. That was one area where I felt JLC was falling behind some of the competition with their power reserves. So nice to see here, but again, just a sleeper option from JLC. People think of the Reverso, they think of the Master Collection, but more people need to think about the Polaris. Now for our final watch here, we have the Glass Huta Original CQ. I love the CQ. The CQ is such a cool German dive watch. It's probably one of the most luxurious dive watches on the market and probably the Rolls Royce of German dive watches when you think about it. Simply beautiful. It's able to still incorporate some Germanic elements and design while of course following the norms of what I think many people would expect from a contemporary dive watch. These watches seem to be catching on a little bit more. I think more people are opening up their eyes to how cool the package is for the CQ. You have 2 different options from sizing. You have the smaller 39.5 millimeter variant that pretty much wears on par with a Black Bay 58. So if you like that sizing, want something with a bit more refinement, not as much leaning into the tool side of things, this would be a cool option. Then you also have the Pano Date versions with that 4 o'clock location of that date, as well as a reverse side sapphire box crystal that shows that beautiful movement on the inside. For the smaller versions, you do have the 3911, although it is going to be hidden from view, still a beautiful striking movement. Some of the best looking movements that you're gonna find under $10,000 without question. And the CQ, certainly a sleeper in the dive watch category. But all right guys, that is my list looking at some great underrated dive watches on the market. What do you think of this list? So there's some other ones that you would mention, consider. I know I couldn't mention everything here, so I know there's gonna be something that I had to not include on this list. And as I was going through this, I was even thinking of things. So if there's other ones that you would recommend, please leave comments down below. Also definitely check out teddybaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. And have some great dive watches to take a look at, so I definitely would recommend that as well. But all right guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.